Hey minions, welcome to Crank It Up. I'm Jim Price, and this is the first episode of something that could be a new series, Last Call, where we take a look at the last card in a faction to solidify its shape. If you haven't watched last week's video on changing cards, go watch that now, as this series will build on that. These videos will be incredibly difficult to make because they rely on my notes and memory, as I had to have been a primary source for these factions, or at least know a strong secondary source, and I will admit that when I started as a playtester, I didn't think about taking notes like this. But anyway, here we go. Over the break, I was thinking about how important it is to understand what was the last card in a faction to solidify. That isn't necessarily the last card to be buffed or nerfed, but more so, the last card to realize its identity. For example, Caparoja changed late for Luchadores to drop the setup requirement on destruction, but for a long time it was a last-minute, in-your-face oppression-style special card. Tweaking the actual values didn't change the function, it was there to mess with you at the last moment. However, the last card to actually take shape in a meaningful way is actually their leader, Senor Mucho Slam. Over the course of the Luchadores development, there were 4 major themes of Mucho Slam that I can recall, and this video will cover what they were and why, and perhaps lead into some insight about the Luchadores. The original Mucho Slam ability was to draw 2 actions from your discard pile as an on-play ability. That's it. I remember vividly pairing this with aliens, and it is as crazy as it sounds. Terraforming and crop circles were played early and often, which was extremely oppressive. When you think about impact actions, drawing a single action from your discard pile seems leader level. We've had 2 elites who can top deck one, although the second elite had a little extra. But the difference between going to hand and going to deck is extreme. In the spamming crop circles example, Mucho Slam would have to stay out every turn to play it every turn, which is a big difference from clearing the board. But the question is, why did Mucho Slam have this ability, and what did it tell us about the faction? Recovering actions would imply that this faction cares about their actions, and to a small extent that's true. Luchadores definitely care about actions, as we see this with their shuffling action as well. But it doesn't tell the whole story, because they specifically care about actions on other players' minions. In my first test game with them, I was trying to spam standard actions because I could. Even if you open up Luchadores a slight bit, that they care about actions that directly affect other players' minions, generic action recursion still doesn't tell the whole story. There are the 3 setups, 2 pins, and 3 actions that care about the presence of setup actions or equivalent actions. Historically, there hadn't been many factions that wanted to play their actions on other players' minions, what I call trap-style actions. And it seemed like Luchadores really wanted to be the faction that changed that, with their emphasis on playing setup actions on minions. The story of Luchador Evolution is one of trying to find the right balance of setup requirements and being flexible with just general actions. For example, Flor Loca used to require a setup action, but does it now, only requiring a generic action, which setup can be an example. This is also true of Caparoja as well, except that the requirement of an action was dropped altogether. It was also true of many of the actions. Today, only Cheap Pop and Reversal care about being a setup, whereas Out for the Count and Pin did at various times. But this creates a problem. While you have instant access to your setups, you only have 3, and if you aren't careful, you end up with more cards that care about a condition than cards that can satisfy that condition, which is exactly what happened with Luchadores. This led into the second major theme of Mucho Slam, the idea of the virtual setup. Many Luchador cards had restrictions requiring a setup action, and Mucho Slam let you bypass that restriction by basically nullifying it. The actual wording is hard to remember, but it wasn't far off from treating cards as if they had setup actions on them. Now over time, I've learned that these types of abilities are giant red flags that indicate that something is very wrong if you need to introduce a condition and then introduce the immediate need to cross it out. But there's also a further problem. Setup only means something to Luchadores. It's the classic internal versus external synergy debate. Ironically, the original Mucho Slam was too external to the point where you could outright ignore your own faction. Instead, he was replaced for something too internal, where you didn't care that you had a partner faction, and the answer should lie somewhere in between. The fact that Mucho Slam was providing value in this context didn't matter, because it meant that the condition was too harshly applied. There wasn't the right balance of caring about setup versus action. If you bypass the need for setups, Do the setups themselves even matter? Is this encouraging them to be bad or not necessary to play if you don't even need to play them anymore? What does quick setup mean anymore? The implications of playing or not playing a virtual card also created tons of questions, and this ability was rightfully scrapped. Around the time of the third major theme, stats started to show Luchadores as being weaker in multiplayer. On the surface, this makes sense because Luchador cards like Pin and Out for the Count target an individual player, which doesn't scale well in multiplayer. The same is also true of Reversal. I can obstruct one player, but not everyone. So it's another classic question. When a faction is doing well in 2-player and seems specifically suited for 2-player, how do you make it better in 3-player without doing too much in 2-player? One of the theories is that burstiness matters more in multiplayer, and by definition the Luchadors are slow. Pin, while great, is a 2-turn plan. So how do you change that? Extra actions, like Quick Setup got. So Mucho Slam started working towards the direction of the current talent, sometimes with or without the action recursion. And this is the version that we know and love today, where you get a one-time on-play ability that I still find really strong, along with a moderately useful talent that serves their purposes well, even if it's one of the more constrained extra plays in the game. This gave Mucho Slam the threat of recurring a powerful action at a time when the Luchadors were heavily special focused, while being able to also quickly pin someone or use Powerful Setup as a burst card. Powerful Setup and Cheap Pop is actually pretty decent for being fast, especially when factoring power activation from Flor Locas. You can generally get away with 6 power, which could be a tag team play on the previous turn. They generate 4 more power, plus 4 from Cheap Pop, and Powerful Setup for 2, which is decent, and you know that another player's minion has to already be there. Or you could start with nothing, lead with Powerful Setup, Flor Loca, and tag team to go from 0 to 12 using fairly common cards. It also meant that Mucho Slam could knock out a minion while still using your regular action to advance their own cause. But for those of you playing at home, this is the third major theme, and I said there were 4, but this is also the version we ultimately got. So what gives? This is because Mucho Slam had an extremely short-lived version, like a day at most, where he recurred an action, but could also be played as a special as a base scored if a minion there was set up. This is 50% insane in a bad way, and 50% insane in an insane way. The idea of burning your leader for second place and guaranteed points from nothing is reminiscent of Pirate King, and not as ideal, but at least you didn't waste a minion play. Shinobis are better suited to that. But the really insane part is that the upside could be extreme. You'd have nothing there but the setup action, let's say Powerful Setup. Then you play Mucho Slam, recur Reversal, and play that. Or you play Reversal, let it go to the discard, play Mucho Slam, get it back, and then Reversal a different minion with a different setup, and it just seems brutal. But it doesn't matter because it was short-lived. And it was short-lived because it really wasn't part of their identity. What does matter is the fact that when you look at each ability paired together, you see 4 different minion shapes for the faction leader. In the first ability, he is a tool. He gets back something else generally in the mid-game. The second ability, he is a crutch, allowing you to overlook a flaw in their game plan while not actively contributing anything other than undoing negative value. The third ability, he is an engine, where you can blend speed and longevity to your own preference. Whereas the fourth ability, he is a counter card meant to be played once in the biggest moment. These 4 abilities cannot be more different. At the time, I didn't have the strongest sense of the 5-card identity myself, so the implications of this were lost on me at the time, and this is going to be heavily biased by someone like me who believes in that identity, but when a leader changes that drastically over the course of a faction, that faction has no identity. It doesn't know what it wants or what it wants to be. And of course cards will change over time, but it should be rare that a leader is reshaped so drastically, and even rarer for an ability to be strictly reverted, even though I think reverting should happen more frequently, but that's a separate topic. For Luchadores throughout their evolution, there's definitely a question of how many specials should they have. What's a Phase 2 card, and what's a Phase 3 card, and what's a 23 special? While I was going over the notes and rereading the forums, I realized something I didn't think about at the time, and I wonder how much of a factor it was in their creativity. I think Luchadors and Mounties want to do very similar things. They both want opposing minion presence, and they aren't necessarily playing for the solo. When you line up Flor Loca and War Canuck, you start to see it, and these factions were released at the same time, making it worse. Luchadors just added an action requirement on top of the minion presence that Mounties have. When you count the number of cards between both factions that care about rival minion presence, the result is staggering. And I think it makes it harder because both cards are stealing ideas from each other as both are trying to develop. It seems like Mounties are trying to steal it in Phase 2 because their Phase 3 card simply isn't that good, whereas the Luchadores struggled to find Phase 2 stuff to do because they were so focused on being in Phase 3. And the answer, of course, is somewhere in between. I think there is definitely a world in which these two factions are released separately, and aspects of Mounties are pulled into the Luchadores. One question I've been mulling over is why the action recursion still exists in the final form when they already have a multi-action recursion card. Sometimes these things are historical. It has it because it had it before. If Mucho Slam never had its original ability, would the final version have arrived at the same conclusion? Did it mean that the actions in general were weak if you needed to rely on playing specific actions over and over again? In that respect, it's a question of having more bullets and less reloads. I used to have a personal rule that when a leader ability changed substantially, all cards in that faction were subject to change because I wanted to evaluate them in the fresh context, to make sure there isn't any historical baggage or anachronisms. I also think that if Mucho Slam started with its current ability, we have a really good shot at getting a 4 setup card, and that sub-theme mechanic gets fleshed out even further. If you look at the 4 themes in isolation, which one really tells the story of Luchadores? It's definitely the third one, the trap-style action play, and that is important because it creates that in-your-face style game plan that players have come to love about Luchadores. But it was certainly an interesting journey to get there. The lesson here is that I really do think it makes sense to get the leader right first, to set the overall tone of the faction, because if you can't solidify one card, it's really hard to lock down 19 others. So there we have it, a historical look at the evolution of Senor Mucho Slam. What do you think of this type of video? Your feedback is more important than ever because these take substantially more time and I only want to do them if you enjoy it. Be warned though that there is a limited pool because of the primary source factor, so this might be more sporadic like Cull the Week. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching, be sure to like and subscribe. Let's shut it down.